Welcome back to Dark Echoes, where the shadows whisper truths too terrifying for daylight. Today we venture into the realm where darkness isn't just an absence of light, it's a living, breathing entity that watches those who work when the world sleeps. The stories you're about to hear were submitted by real people, people who thought they understood what loneliness meant, until they discovered they were never truly alone during those long, endless nights. Tonight, I bring you 3 accounts from the graveyard shift. 3 testimonies from those who've learned that some jobs come with more than just a paycheck. Our first story comes from Marcus, a security guard who learned that some buildings hold more than just empty offices and forgotten memories. Story 1, The Watcher in the Walls. I've been working security for over 15 years. I've seen homeless people try to break in, dealt with false alarms, and even caught a few actual burglars. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during my 3 months at the Meridian Corporate Center. The building was a typical downtown high-rise, 42 floors of offices, law firms, and consulting groups. During the day, it buzzed with hundreds of employees. But at night, it became something else entirely. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The first few weeks were routine. I'd make my rounds every 2 hours, check the parking garage, monitor the security cameras, and catch up on Netflix between patrols. Easy money, I thought. The building had this central atrium that went all the way up to the top floor. During the day, natural light would filter down through the skylights. At night, it became this vast, echoing cavern of shadows. The sound of my footsteps would bounce off the walls and return to me, sometimes sounding like someone else was walking nearby. It was during my 3rd week that I first noticed the elevator. Every night around 2:30 a.m., elevator number 3 would activate on its own. I'd hear the familiar ding, watch the numbers light up as it traveled from floor to floor. Sometimes it would stop at random levels, doors opening and closing, before returning to the lobby. I reported it to maintenance. They said it was probably a software glitch, something about the elevator's automatic maintenance cycle. They'd look into it, they said. They never did, but the elevator was just the beginning. One night I was doing my usual rounds on the 15th floor when I heard typing. Not unusual, right? People work late sometimes. Except it was 3 a.m. and I'd already checked the building logs. No one had badged in or out since 6 p.m. I followed the sound to a corner office. The nameplate read, Sarah Chen, Financial Analyst. Through the frosted glass, I could see the glow of a computer screen and the silhouette of someone sitting at the desk. I knocked. "Excuse me, this is building security. I need to see some ID." The typing stopped. The silhouette didn't move. "Ma'am, I need you to open the door." Nothing. I used my master key and pushed the door open. The office was empty. The computer was off. The chair was pushed neatly under the desk, but the keyboard was still warm. I told myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. Phones would ring in empty offices. I'd answer them to nothing but static and what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. Lights would flicker in patterns, always the same sequence. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Like someone was trying to communicate. But the worst part was the cameras. During my 4th week, I was reviewing the security footage from the previous night when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the camera covering the 20th floor hallway, there was a figure. Dark, humanoid, but wrong somehow. It moved down the corridor, not walking but gliding, its form seeming to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on it. I rewound the footage. The figure was there again, following the exact same path. But this time, I noticed something else. At the end of the hallway, it stopped in front of the camera and looked directly into it. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness. but somehow I knew it was looking at me. Not at the camera, at me, watching through the monitor. I fast-forwarded through the rest of the night's footage. The figure appeared on different floors, always moving through the building like it owned the place. And every time it encountered a camera, it would stop and stare directly into the lens. I started carrying a flashlight with me, even though the building was well lit. The shadows seemed deeper somehow, like they were reaching out to grab me. The silence between my footsteps felt heavy, pregnant with unseen presences. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was a Thursday, around 1 a.m. I was in the security office, trying to stay awake with my fourth cup of coffee, when all the monitors went black simultaneously. Not turned off, black, like they were showing pure darkness. I checked the power connections, tried resetting the system. Nothing worked. Then slowly, the screens began to flicker back to life. But instead of showing the usual camera feeds, they all displayed the same image, the 20th floor hallway. And standing at the end of that hallway was the figure. But this time, it wasn't on the recording. This was happening live. I grabbed my radio and my flashlight and headed for the elevator, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. The ride to the 20th floor felt like an eternity. The elevator music, usually an annoying instrumental version of some pop song, sounded distorted, playing backwards. When the doors opened, the hallway was pitch black. The emergency lighting, which should have been on, was dead. My flashlight beam seemed weaker somehow, like the darkness was actively fighting against it. I stepped out and immediately felt the temperature drop. My breath came out in visible puffs. In July, in a climate-controlled building. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely. "This is building security. If someone's up here, you need to identify yourself." From somewhere down the hallway came a sound that still haunts my dreams. It wasn't quite human, like someone trying to speak, but having forgotten how. The words were garbled, unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably mocking. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in that elevator and never return, but something compelled me forward. Maybe it was professional duty, maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe something else was controlling my actions. I walked down the hallway, my flashlight beam dancing across empty offices and abandoned cubicles. The sound came again, closer this time. It seemed to be coming from the office at the very end of the hall, the corner office that belonged to the company's CEO. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. My flashlight beam swept across an executive desk, leather chairs, awards on the walls. Everything looked normal, too normal. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, like old flowers or decay. But as I stood there, it grew stronger, more putrid, like something had died and been left to rot. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the office's floor-to-ceiling windows, standing directly behind me, was the figure from the cameras.
Up close,
I could see that it wasn't solid. Its edges seemed to ripple and shift like smoke, but its presence was undeniably real. Where its eyes should have been were 2 points of absolute darkness, not black, but the complete absence of anything. I spun around, nothing there. But in the window's reflection, it remained, now reaching out toward me with arms that seemed to stretch impossibly long. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran like my life depended on it because I genuinely believed it did. I could hear it behind me, not footsteps, but a sound like wind rushing through dead leaves. The elevator doors couldn't close fast enough. Back in the security office, I immediately called my supervisor. I told him everything, the elevator, the typing, the figure, all of it. He listened patiently, then suggested I take a few days off. "Night shifts can be tough," he said. Sometimes the mind plays tricks. I wanted to argue, but how do you convince someone of something so impossible? I did take those days off. And when I came back, I found out that I wasn't the first security guard to report strange occurrences in the building. There had been others over the years, lots of others. None of them stayed long. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the next day. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that something is watching me. And in the corner of my vision, just at the edge of perception, I can sometimes see a dark figure standing motionless, patient, waiting for something. Some buildings, I've learned, are more than just steel and concrete. Some buildings, remember, and some of them are hungry. Story 2. The Hospital Worker. Our second story comes from Jennifer, a night shift nurse who discovered that in some hospitals, not all the patients are among the living. I've been a nurse for 12 years, 8 of which I spent working the night shift at St. Mary's General Hospital. If you've never worked nights in a hospital, let me tell you, it's a different world. The daytime chaos of doctors making rounds, families visiting, and constant activity gives way to something much more still. But still doesn't mean peaceful. Hospitals never truly sleep. St. Mary's was an old building, constructed in the 1940s and expanded several times over the decades. The result was a maze of corridors, stairwells that led nowhere, and rooms that seemed to have been forgotten by the architectural plans. The kind of place where you could work for years and still discover new areas. I was assigned to the ICU on the 4th floor. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights it was just me and one other nurse covering 24 patients. The work was demanding, but I'd grown used to the rhythm of it. The quiet beeping of monitors, the soft whoosh of ventilators, the occasional call light from a patient who couldn't sleep. What I wasn't used to was the elevator stopping on the 3rd floor. See, the 3rd floor had been closed for renovations for over 2 years. Budget cuts kept pushing the project back, and eventually it became a running joke among the staff. Maybe they'll finish the 3rd floor by the time I retire, we'd say. The elevator was programmed to skip the 3rd floor entirely. If you pressed the button, nothing would happen. The floor simply didn't exist in the elevator's memory. Except sometimes, late at night, it would stop there anyway. The first time it happened, I was heading down to the pharmacy in the basement. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, doors opening to reveal a darkened hallway with plastic sheeting hanging from the ceiling and construction equipment scattered around. I figured it was a malfunction and pressed the door close button. But just before the doors shut, I could have sworn I heard voices coming from somewhere in that dark corridor. Quiet voices like people having a conversation in hushed tones. I mentioned it to my supervisor the next morning. She said she'd report it to maintenance, but these things took time to fix. "Just don't get off on the 3rd floor," she said, with a laugh. God knows what you might find up there. If only I'd listened to her. The elevator continued to stop on the 3rd floor intermittently over the next few weeks. Always during my shift, always when I was alone, and every time I'd hear something from that dark hallway, voices, footsteps, sometimes what sounded like medical equipment being moved around, my curiosity finally got the better of me. It was a Tuesday night around 2 a.m. The ICU was quiet, all our patients were stable, and my partner was taking her break. When the elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, instead of pressing the door close button, I stepped out. The hallway stretched in both directions, illuminated only by a few emergency lights that cast long, eerie shadows. The plastic sheeting hung like ghosts in the stagnant air, and the smell of old paint and dust filled my nostrils. I walked slowly down the corridor, my soft-soled shoes silent on the linoleum floor. The patient rooms were empty, their doors standing open like mouths waiting to swallow the unwary. Medical equipment sat covered in sheets, looking like strange monuments in the darkness. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time, the sound of a patient call light. The electronic chime was coming from one of the rooms about halfway down the hall, room 312. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The call light above the door was indeed flashing, casting an intermittent red glow on the walls. I peered into the room, empty, like all the others. But the call light continued to flash and the chiming continued. I stepped inside and pressed the call button to turn it off. The room fell silent. But as I turned to leave, the call light in the next room started flashing, then the one after that. Soon, the entire corridor was alive with the sound of call lights, an electronic symphony of patients demanding attention, patients that weren't there. I ran back to the elevator, pressing the button frantically. When the doors finally opened, I practically dove inside, hitting the button for the 4th floor, over and over until the doors closed. Back in the ICU, I tried to convince myself it was some kind of electrical problem. Old wiring maybe, causing the call system to malfunction. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the explanation. I started avoiding the elevator after that, taking the stairs whenever possible. But sometimes, when you're carrying medications or pushing equipment, the stairs aren't an option. 2 weeks later, I found myself in the elevator again, this time with Mrs. Patterson from room 418. She was being transferred to radiology for an emergency CT scan, and I was accompanying her. Mrs. Patterson was unconscious, heavily sedated after a stroke that had left her barely clinging to life. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor. The doors opened to that familiar darkened hallway, but this time, something was different. The call lights weren't flashing. Instead, there was a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It looked like a patient, hospital gown, IV pole, the works. But there was something wrong with the way it moved. Too stiff, too deliberate. It began walking toward the elevator, its bare feet making no sound on the linoleum. I pressed the door close button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The figure continued approaching, and as it got closer, I could see that its hospital gown was old-fashioned, the kind they used decades ago. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were completely black. Just as it reached the elevator, Mrs. Patterson suddenly sat up on her gurney, despite being heavily sedated. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at the figure. "Helen," she whispered in a voice barely audible. "Helen, is that you?" The figure stopped and tilted its head as if listening. Then slowly it smiled. It was the most unsettling smile I've ever seen, too wide, too knowing. The elevator doors finally closed. Mrs. Patterson remained conscious for the rest of the trip to radiology, talking quietly about her sister Helen, who had died 30 years earlier in a car accident. She kept asking why Helen was wearing a hospital gown, why she looked so sad. By the time we returned to the ICU, Mrs. Patterson had slipped back into unconsciousness. She died 3 hours later, never waking up again. But just before she passed, she smiled that same unsettling smile I'd seen on the figure's face. I started researching the hospital's history after that. What I found chilled me to the bone. The 3rd floor had been a psychiatric ward from 1947 to 1982. It was closed down after a series of incidents that the hospital administration had worked very hard to keep quiet. Patient suicides, unexplained deaths, reports of staff members having nervous breakdowns after working there. The most disturbing discovery was a newspaper article from 1978 about a patient named Helen Morrison, who had died under mysterious circumstances on the 3rd floor. She'd been found in her room, apparently having died in her sleep, but with that same unsettling smile on her face. The article included a photograph of Helen. It was the same face I'd seen in the elevator. I put in for a transfer to the day shift immediately, But even now, working in the relative safety of daylight hours, I sometimes find myself thinking about that third floor, about the call lights that flash for patients who aren't there, about Helen Morrison and her terrible smile. And sometimes, late at night when I'm at home, I'll hear the electronic chime of a hospital call light, even though I live in a house that's never seen a day of medical care. Some places, I've learned, don't let go of their residents easily. And some residents don't want to leave, even after death has officially discharged them. The third floor at St. Mary's is still closed for renovations. It's been 5 years now and they keep pushing back the completion date. Maybe they know something the rest of us don't. Maybe some floors are better left empty. Story 3, The Janitor. Our final story tonight comes from David, a night janitor, who learned that some lessons continue long after the final bell has rung. 23 years. That's how long I worked as the night janitor at Riverside Elementary School. I started when I was 25, fresh out of a divorce, and needing steady work with good benefits. The job was simple: clean the classrooms, mop the halls, empty the trash, and lock up before dawn. For over 2 decades, those halls were my domain. I knew every squeaky floorboard, every flickering light, every door that didn't close properly. The school was built in 1963, and by the time I started working there, it had that lived-in feeling that only comes with decades of children's laughter, tears, and dreams echoing through its corridors. During the day, Riverside was alive with the energy of 300 students and 30 staff members. But at night, when I arrived at 10 p.m. to begin my shift, it transformed into something else entirely. The empty classrooms felt like theaters waiting for performances that would never come. The hallways stretched longer in the darkness, and shadows seemed to pool in corners where they hadn't been during daylight hours. I'd grown comfortable with the solitude. In fact, I preferred the quiet. It gave me time to think, to work at my own pace, and to take pride in preparing the school for another day of learning. That comfort lasted for 22 years and 11 months. It was during my final month on the job, I was planning to retire at the end of the school year, when things began to change. It started with Classroom 3B. Mrs. Henderson's third grade class was my favorite to clean. She kept her room organized, never left much mess, and always had encouraging posters on the walls that made me smile, even during the loneliest parts of my shift. You can do anything, and every day is a new adventure. Simple messages, but they meant something to a man spending his nights alone in empty hallways. One Tuesday night in May, I was cleaning 3B when I heard something that stopped me in my tracks: the sound of children reciting the alphabet. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but unmistakably the sing-song cadence of young voices working through their ABCs. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. I stood perfectly still, mop in hand, listening. The voices continued through the entire alphabet, then started over again. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. No after-school programs ran this late, and I was the only person in the building. I stepped into the hallway trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint. Then abruptly, it stopped. I convinced myself it was the building's ventilation system creating weird acoustic effects. Old buildings make strange noises, I told myself. Nothing more to it than that. But the next night, it happened again. This time in classroom 2A, I was emptying the pencil sharpener when I heard the sound of children giggling, followed by a teacher's voice saying, "Okay, class, let's practice our addition tables." I stepped out into the hallway immediately, but the sounds stopped the moment I left the room. When I went back inside, the classroom was silent, except for the hum of the ancient fluorescent lights. This pattern continued for a week. Every night, different classrooms would fill with the phantom sounds of lessons being taught. math recitations, reading aloud, even art class instructions. Remember to clean your brushes before switching colors.
I started keeping a log, writing down which rooms were active each night and what I heard. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The phantom lessons were following the exact same curriculum that had been taught in those rooms during the day. How did I know this? Because I'd been working at Riverside long enough to recognize the teachers' voices, even when they were speaking from empty classrooms in the middle of the night. Mrs. Rodriguez from kindergarten working on color recognition. Can everyone point to something red in the room? Mr. Thompson from 5th grade reviewing science concepts. What are the 3 states of matter? Ms. Park from 4th grade leading a discussion about the Revolutionary War. Who can tell me why the colonists were upset about taxation without representation? These weren't recordings or echoes. These were interactive lessons, complete with pauses for student responses that I couldn't hear. The teachers would wait, as if listening to answers, then respond accordingly. Very good, Sarah, or almost Tommy, but remember to carry the 1. I began to dread entering certain classrooms. The phantom lessons were becoming more frequent, and they were starting to overlap. I'd hear multiplication tables from one room, while addition was being taught in the classroom next door. The sound would seep through the walls, creating a cacophony of educational chaos. But the worst part wasn't the disembodied lessons. The worst part was when they started to notice me. It happened on a Thursday night in classroom 4C. I was cleaning the whiteboard when Mr. Harris's voice began reviewing grammar rules. Remember, class and apostrophe shows possession or is used in contractions. I'd grown somewhat used to these phantom lessons, so I continued working, trying to ignore the voice. But then Mr. Harris said something that made my blood freeze. Mr. Johnson, our night janitor, is here with us tonight. Can someone tell Mr. Johnson what an apostrophe is used for? There was a pause, as if waiting for students to raise their hands. Then, that's right, Katie. Mr. Johnson, did you hear that? An apostrophe shows possession. I dropped my cleaning supplies and backed toward the door. The voice continued. Don't leave yet, Mr. Johnson. We're just getting started with tonight's lesson. I ran for the first time in 23 years. I ran through those hallways like something was chasing me. And maybe something was, because I could hear doors opening behind me and the sound of small footsteps following me down the corridor. I didn't stop running until I reached my custodial closet, where I locked the door and sat among the cleaning supplies, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next night, I almost didn't come to work, but I needed the job. Retirement was just weeks away, and I couldn't afford to lose my pension over what might have been an elaborate hallucination, brought on by too many years of solitary night shifts. I decided to finish out my time, but I changed my routine. Instead of entering the classrooms, I would clean only the hallways and common areas. I could mop and empty trash cans without going into any rooms where phantom lessons might be taking place. It worked for exactly one night. On Saturday, as I was mopping the main hallway, every classroom door in the building opened simultaneously. Not slowly, not with any visible force, just all at once, as if controlled by some invisible signal. Light poured out of each room, even though I knew I hadn't turned on any classroom lights, and with the light came voices. Dozens of voices, teachers and students, all talking at once, creating a wall of sound that was both familiar and terrifying. But underneath all those voices, I heard something else. Footsteps, small footsteps, like children walking in formation. They were coming out of the classrooms and into the hallway. I looked toward the nearest classroom door and saw them. Children, dozens of them. But they weren't quite right. They seemed faded, like old photographs come to life. Their clothes were from different eras, some wore modern outfits I recognized from current students. Others wore clothing that looked decades out of date. They were walking toward me in perfect lines, the way children are taught to move through school hallways. No talking, hands at their sides, eyes forward. But as they got closer, they all turned their heads to look at me. Their eyes were empty, not black, not white, just empty, like looking into holes in their faces. The teacher voices continued from the classrooms. Remember to walk quietly in the halls. Single file, everyone. Mr. Johnson has been taking good care of our school for a very long time. The children stopped about 10 feet away from me, forming a semicircle. They stood there silently, those empty eyes fixed on me, while their phantom teachers continued their lessons in the background. Then, in unison, they spoke. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for keeping our school clean. Thank you for taking care of us. Their voices were like whispers, amplified, echoing off the walls and ceiling. And as they spoke, I realized what I was seeing. Every child who had ever attended Riverside Elementary, going back to when the school first opened, generations of students saying goodbye to the janitor who had cleaned up after them for more than 2 decades. I wasn't scared anymore. I was honored in a strange way. These phantom children, these echoes of lessons past, they weren't trying to frighten me. They were thanking me. I stood up straighter and nodded to them. "You're welcome," I said aloud. "It's been my privilege." The children smiled at least. I think they smiled, though it was hard to tell with those empty eyes. Then, one by one, they turned and walked back into their classrooms. The lights dimmed, the doors closed, and the hallway returned to its familiar nighttime quiet. I finished my shift that night without any further disturbances. And for my remaining 2 weeks at Riverside Elementary, the phantom lessons stopped entirely. The building returned to its normal nighttime stillness, as if the students and teachers had said everything they needed to say. On my last night, I found a note on my custodial cart. It was written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Johnson. We'll miss you." It wasn't signed, and I never found out which student had left it. But somehow, I don't think it was written by any living child. I retired as planned, but I still drive by Riverside Elementary sometimes. It's still operating, still filled with the laughter and energy of children during the day. They have a new night janitor now, a young man who reminds me of myself 23 years ago. I wonder if he's heard the phantom lessons yet. I wonder if he'll understand, when he does, that some schools never really close. Some lessons continue long after the students have grown up and moved on, taught by teachers whose dedication transcends even death. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in the quiet hours of the night, you can still hear the echo of every lesson ever taught, every word ever spoken in pursuit of knowledge and growth. Schools, you see, are more than just buildings. They're repositories of human potential. That energy never truly fades. 3 stories from the night shift. 3 accounts of people who discovered that darkness doesn't just hide things, it reveals them. Marcus learned that some buildings are more than steel and concrete. Jennifer discovered that healing doesn't always end with discharge, and David found that education continues even after the final bell. What is it about the night shift that opens doorways to experiences beyond our understanding? Perhaps it's the solitude that makes us more sensitive to things we normally ignore. Perhaps it's the darkness that strips away our rational defenses. Or perhaps the night shift workers are simply the guardians of a world that most of us never see. If you work the graveyard shift, if you know the weight of empty hours and echoing footsteps, then you understand what our storytellers went through. You know that being alone doesn't always mean being alone. Do you have a story from your night shift, an encounter that defied explanation? A moment when you realized you weren't as alone as you thought? Send your stories to Dark Echoes. Your experience might be featured in a future episode. Until next time, remember, the darkness isn't empty. It's waiting, it's watching, and sometimes it's working the night shift right alongside you. This has been Dark Echoes. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them.